Hello, everybody. It's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just wanted to do this short video to give you a sense of the Mexican War for Independence and also what was happening in South America in terms of independence, and just kind of note that these are occurring on the timeline after the revolution in, amongst like the American colonists and Britain, the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. All of those revolutions precede the Latin American revolutions or independence movements, rather, in Mexico and in South America. So, kind of when you're thinking about causes of, say, the Mexican War of Independence, kind of put in your box, in a sense, in addition to some of the other causes you might be thinking of, some of these earlier revolutions exist, in a sense, sometimes as causes of their own. But when we looked at the Haitian Revolution, we noted that there's a lot of external factors. So the way, for example, that the French Revolution begins and how there's a kind of a focus on and question on the monarch. And then ultimately the French Revolution gets very, very radical. And then it gets a lot more conservative and under Napoleon. So that entire kind of timeline of the French Revolution plays out during the Haitian Revolution and has a lot of effects on people's actions during the Haitian Revolution. In the case of the independence movements in Latin America, we also have something similar. We're a little bit later in the timeline. So in this case, we're not talking about the French Revolution, but we are talking about Napoleon and the Napoleonic era, and a lot of the actions of Napoleon, in particular around 1808, 1809, 1810, how those actions become really significant, okay? So, a couple of like context things I have on here. There is a time that Spain was very much against France when France was radicalizing during the French Revolution. This is like a little bit odd because Spain had largely been always opposing Britain, but Spain does kind of go with Britain in the first coalition and oppose France. So it's kind of interesting. That's as early as 1791. By 1796, we see this turn around. Part of this is because the French Revolution has become a little bit more conservative, and Spain becomes tied to France. Portugal, next to Spain, is still tied with Britain. And, we don't see Spain in the second coalition, against France. So, just kind of have an idea of that. And for a while, this means Spain and Britain are opposing each other. And some of this war, is going to play out in Europe, but some of it also plays out in the colonies. The British Navy, for example, tries to cut Spain off from the colonies because they're economically very lucrative. And there is kind of a lot of penalties that maybe folks who are Creoles, for example, who were, trading with Britain, even illegally, some of that gets doused. By 1803, Britain has declared war on France, so Britain and France are at war, and Spain is largely tied to France at this time. In 1806, Britain is like trying to make a decision, basically. Are they going to focus on France and Spain in Europe, or are they going to focus on France and Spain in, the New World? So maybe some of this, like Napoleon had this vision of trying to take France and make it, the Louisiana Territory and the Caribbean, and, all of that doesn't necessarily play out for France. But in that, we also see Great Britain trying to grab, we saw this in Haiti. We also see it in Buenos Aires. Great Britain is going to try to target the colonies, get its peace, try to maintain, and it doesn't. It's actually beat back by a Creole-led army. And so there is some action on the behalf of like the Spanish colonists to kind of act independently, in particular against a foreign power like Great Britain. So, all of that context is not necessarily going to come up in your essay, but just kind of giving you some context to understand some of the movements in 1808 and 1809, 1810. By 1807, Napoleon is crafting his continental system. He's really trying to dig hard into Great Britain and not allow anyone to trade with Great Britain. Portugal, which is an ally of Great Britain, wants to continue to trade with Great Britain. And so Napoleon is basically looking for a way to invade Portugal to enforce the continental system. In order to do this, Napoleon will discuss going through Spain, and this is the subject of a very famous painting by Goya known as the 3rd of May. We see the French army on the right, with their guns, and individuals in Spain who are resisting Napoleon's army. So there is kind of a public response in Spain as Napoleon's army trudges through. They don't like it. They don't want it. They don't want this takeover. And Napoleon thinks because France is an ally, it can just kind of, tell it what to do. There's a lot of resistance to that. And we sort of see a bloodbath. And that's part of what Goya's painting is suggesting. So like the signs of rebellion are kind of in Spain as well as what happens in the colonies. By the time we get to 1808, 1809 into 1810, we have Napoleon essentially trying to get to Portugal. Portugal will be attacked and Portugal's government will flee to Brazil. So this is going to really kick off what we would call Brazil's war for independence. Not really quite a war, but it really unfolds as the government really starts to dominate. This is the Portuguese government dominating from Brazil, and we'll kind of tackle that a little bit later. But in the country of Spain, Napoleon deposes the leader who is known as Charles IV. He's not really highlighted as a very bright Bourbon leader, but his son, Ferdinand VII, was going to be put in power. Spanish, kind of people are connected to Ferdinand VII. Some historians argue that the way the Spanish government was organized, it's kind of like people show loyalty to the monarch. It is a monarchy, and so, Ferdinand VII, if he was to be the ruler, people feel like they're kind of part of his family and he's the benevolent monarch and he's going to take care of them. This might exist arguably in the colonies as well, but this gets trashed when Napoleon puts his brother Joseph into the rule. And so we get kind of this deposed Spanish monarch and a reaction to this. So the Spanish throughout cities in Spain, we see these local ragtag governments known as juntas. This becomes something that replicates itself in the New World. And you see in Venezuela, for example, you see in Buenos Aires, attempts at juntas, and a lot of these will be Creole-led. In Mexico, we see a junta, but then very quickly the Peninsulares will run the junta. So we don't really have a long-lasting Creole junta. We have a Peninsulares run quote unquote junta. And one of the reasons Father Hidalgo is going to go and kind of conspire this revolution is he's part of a large conspiracy against the Peninsulares, who have kind of put themselves in power in New Spain. Okay. This really gives us a kind of wide view of royalists versus patriots within the New World colony. So New Spain or New Granada or wherever, we see people who are Spanish colonists who are royalists, like AKA Peninsulares. Sometimes they also get on their side other groups of people who have been dissed by the Creoles, and we get patriots who oftentimes are largely Creoles, and in some cases also bottom, classes, depending on if the Creoles can convince them to join. And this becomes distinct, in the various places where the revolution plays out. By 1812, right, there is a Cortes in Cadiz. Cadiz is in Spain. The junta kind of develops into a parliament, and the parliament writes a constitution because the people in Cadiz are generally liberal-minded. They write a very liberal constitution. They end things like the Spanish Inquisition, and they make a constitution that is really quite liberal. Freedom of speech, and essentially limiting the powers of the monarch in Spain. And this is intentional, right, to kind of give the legislature a lot more say over the monarch. But the Cortes really does not extend a lot of the rights to Creoles in the New World. and Creoles arguably want greater political rights. So, this tension about the liberal constitution and what it could potentially offer, some of the juntas are going to get, interested in trying to fight for the liberal constitution. Doesn't really quite go down that way because the Peninsulares are going to fight for their rights. And so we get, in some cases, a little bit of a civil war, or, a back and forth type of war. In 1814, we see Ferdinand VII comes back, and you would think he would just embrace the Cadiz Constitution and the monarch, and the Cortes would be the same, but they're not. Ferdinand kind of brings back a little bit of the hardball, and underneath Ferdinand VII, Peninsulares are kind of rewarded, and there is an attempt for there to be, a crackdown on other groups. And had this continued, it's likely Ferdinand VII would have gotten his way, and the monarch would have, kind of cracked down, and we might have seen the end of Spanish independence movements. But in the meantime, we get the Cadiz Constitution back in 1820. How does that happen? Because there is a rebellion of people in the military who are supposed to go to the New World and like fight for Ferdinand VII to kind of take back monarch control. There's this massive rebellion, and the Cadiz Constitution comes back. So by 1820, between 1810 and 1820, you have these various movements like Hidalgo's, like Morales's movement, that includes Creoles plus some groups of indigenous people and mestizos. They kind of go together, and they have all these followers, and 80,000 people are trying to fight for equality. Some of that backfires because Creoles get very nervous about the violence and some of the activity that the Father Hidalgo's and Father Morales's groups get involved in, and the revolutions kind of peter out. But at the same time, by 1820, there's a much different kind of perception amongst Creoles because they get very, very nervous about this liberal constitution. So the way that the Mexican War of Independence ends is we get a very conservative kind of it's a conservative end with a overall, by the time it all rains out, a monarch slash emperor in place in terms of Augustine Iturbide, but we do get a huge movement toward Creoles kind of becoming not only like the leaders in the hierarchy. Peninsulares is kind of marginalized, and when the Cadiz Constitution comes back, there are kind of a great deal of pushback against Peninsulares, and Creoles become almost like fitting into the Peninsulares' shoes. And there's a lot of fear of social change. So one thing we see political change in the Mexican War of Independence, but we don't see a lot of social change, despite that being part of the movement, okay? All right, I'm going to start a different video for Simon Bolivar and some of the things happening with Argentina and Gran Colombia / what is essentially Venezuela at the time. Okay, be well.